Welcome back. Glad you found part 2 of this talk. You were looking at some passages about the humanity of Jesus, and you should have found things like this. First of all, in Luke 2, we hear that the teenage Jesus learned. And we learn that the child Jesus grew, and that he grew in wisdom. And these are very much human things. In Luke 4, in the wilderness, he was hungry, he was tempted. In John 2, when he clears the temple, he shows anger. In the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26, Jesus is afraid. Jesus wrestles with what the Father is asking him to do, and he is obedient. And in Hebrews 5, Jesus learned obedience through suffering. They're all very human things. But was he more than human? In what ways did the New Testament think of Jesus? We're going to look at some examples in the Gospels now, which will help us to see, did they think of him as more than a human being? First, we're going to look at Mark, and obviously it'd be helpful to have a Bible with you as we go through some of these things. Throughout Mark's Gospel, there tends to be a cry, who is this? What's going on? What's happening? And again, Mark records that they were all amazed. And they asked the question, who is this? And again, they were astonished. Common ways throughout Mark, you get the crowd being amazed and asking questions. That's the impact of Jesus. Mark looks at this in a very interesting way. Throughout Mark's Gospel, there are these cries, there are these voices, beginning in the first verse, where Mark himself talks about this is the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's Mark himself seeking to answer who is Jesus. At the baptism, there is a voice from heaven, you are my beloved Son. Throughout Mark's Gospel, there are the demonic voices, the Holy One of God. Peter at Caesarea Philippi says, you are the Christ, when Jesus says, who do people say I am? At the Transfiguration, there's another voice from heaven, this is my beloved Son. And at the trial, when he's asked, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? For the first time in Mark's Gospel, really, Jesus himself cries out, I am. Then if we look at the climax of Mark, we find something extraordinary. Because as Jesus dies, the centurion, his executioner, says, truly this man was the Son of God. A cry of a Gentile executioner. And it's interesting that at the beginning of his gospel, Mark refers to Jesus as Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And this dramatic climax to the gospel, obviously to be followed by the resurrection, but this is really the dramatic climax. A Gentile, a Roman executioner says, truly this man was the Son of God. Let's look at John, and particularly the prologue, the very famous beginning of John's Gospel, and I'll read you some of it. We're going to read John 1 to 5, John 1 to 5, and then verses 14 to 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. And then in verse 14, The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me. From the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known." It's an extraordinary passage. So what's being said about who Jesus is and what he has done? Well, the Word was God, was in the beginning with God, and even involved in creation, the thing that only God can do, the Word was involved in. And Jesus, of course, is the Word made flesh. And then we have seen his glory as of the one and only Son of the Father. The Greek is monogenes para patros, only begotten of the Father, which some translations use. And then in verse 18, which is extraordinary, the best manuscripts talk about Jesus as monogenes theos, God, the one and only. The commentator Leo Morris prefers to translate it as the only begotten God. In some manuscripts, huios replaces theos, the one and only or the only begotten Son, but the best manuscripts have that theos in. Jesus makes God known. Jesus shows us God. He's more than just a human being. He makes God known. He shows us God. He is even described as God, the one and only. Then at the conclusion of John, we have a very familiar passage. I'm just going to read it to you. John 20, 26 to 31. When I found it. This is when Thomas appears, when Thomas has questioned whether Jesus was written, and it's the week later. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." Now it's interesting, this point, to think about what happens in Acts 14, verses 11 to 17, which I'll quickly find. It's in a place called Lystra, and there's been a miraculous healing involving Paul and Barnabas. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in their own language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to him. They wanted to call them gods and worship them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, human like you." There's a contrast here between the distress of Paul and Barnabas, horrified that they're being worshipped and regarded as gods, and with the response of Jesus to Thomas. Because Jesus welcomes Thomas's worship. And here is a really key point. from the earliest days, these Jewish monotheists worshipped Jesus. That would have been shocking to them if you'd have told them beforehand that they would end up worshipping Jesus. But they did worship Jesus. And that's huge evidence for the early church thinking that Jesus was more than just a human being from the earliest days. So that introduces us to the idea that Jesus is more than just a human being, and we will explore that further in class. And some passages we're going to look at, you might want to look at between now and then. Hebrews 1:1-8. And then passages where Jesus is called Lord in applying Old Testament passages referring to Yahweh. You might like to look at these. Romans 10:9-13. Joel 2:28-32, Acts 2:36-39. It's very significant that the New Testament is most comfortable calling Jesus Lord. And we'll bring out the significance of that in our session in class. If you'd like to dig deeper into some of this stuff, there are extracts on Moodle. Particular ones you might like to look at are the extract from Kaiser about this issue of Jesus being called Lord. And also you might like to look at the extracts from Marcus Borg and Tom Wright, and we're going to look at those in particular in our mid-month session next month. So that's all for now. I hope you've had your appetite whetted, and we'll see you when the course starts in earnest next month.